lessons? I mean, woo, good stuff. So I'll do my best today to fill in for him. Don't judge me because, I know he's a hard teacher to replace. I mean, he's so smart. So, our lesson today, our topic is God's will. Our topic is God's will, and God expects us to seek His will instead of trying to impose our own. What we want to get out of our lesson today is hopefully I lose them faster than I get them. Hopefully, we can learn to contemplate how we treat God. And I don't know, is He a bystander in your life, or have you subjected your will to His? So we're going to look at chapters 24 to 27. It's a long gap, a lot to learn there, and we're not going to learn it all. I guarantee. We're just going to skim the surface. What's that? Well, we are, because it's already long.
We're going to get through 50 chapters in the next week, 2 weeks?
2 weeks, yeah. Yep. But I'm not going to if you keep talking to me. So if you distract me, it's not going to happen. So in chapter 24 to 27, we're going to see that Isaac and Rebekah had twin boys, Esau and Jacob, but they were hardly anything alike. Isaac favored Esau, Rebekah favored Jacob, and although God promised to bless Jacob over Esau, Rebekah and Jacob schemed to trick Isaac into giving his birthright to Jacob instead of Esau. So we're going to talk about that. Our slides are outlined for today. Got to turn that on too. Our slide for today, our outline is going to look like that. There's a lot to cover, and so we're literally just going to read and go over it. There's not going to be tons of application, but trust me, a lot of interesting stuff happening here, so if you have some of your own time, go into it. There's a lot we can't touch on, just don't have the time. But it's worth looking at. So, any of you watch any late night TV or seen any of these items before? Infomercials. How about ShamWow? Everyone remembers ShamWow, right? So I remember some of them. See, and what I was going to do is say, now I got some fancy doodad called the tooth whitener. It's a machine. Now I know you're looking at me thinking, why do you need that? I know my teeth are good to begin with, but they're pretty pearly right now, right? Pretty great stuff. But what makes infomercials so convincing, appealing? Did you guys know that the infomercials are actually based on neuroscience? They've actually done the science on this. And the goal is to raise the viewer's dopamine levels by creating an emotional roller coaster. So it creates a dopamine rush for us. And then by the end of the commercial, the viewer feels like he must buy the product. And then, of course, what do?
Oh, wait, there's more.
Exactly. Or they say there's more. That's the emotional roller coaster. And it's shown they can get even the most savvy of purchasers, of people, to buy. And in the end, well, the dopamine rush lasts for 6 minutes. That's it, just 6 minutes. You're still laughing at me?
You're sure you got the tag from the watch.
Oh, is it? I had my son run out because I wanted him to find a shirt that was not characteristic of me so I could try to pull this off. Where's my tag at?
Right there. Extra large.
Oh, there you go. See? But of course, at the end of the commercial, the rush lasts for 6 minutes. the dopamine rush. So at the end of the commercial, what do you hear? Buy now. Operators standing by, only 3 minutes left to buy. And then, of course, you rush out and you buy. So the biblical account today includes a production that is just as deceptive as an infomercial. And it was intended to influence a major decision. So here's where I was supposed to take my disguise off and say, surprise, I fooled you guys. Right? Did it work? Yeah. I knew it would work. I just knew it. But the reason I wanted to do that is the question is, have you ever been fooled by a disguise? Maybe you have. If you've been fooled by one, you wouldn't have known it, right? But we're going to also look at a biblical account in today's lesson that covers a person wearing a disguise to trick someone into making a decision against their will. So we're going to cover all of that today. And the decision that the tricked person made was according to God's will, but we'll see that the way it went down was all wrong. In fact, no one involved in the decision ever considered consulting God. And this lesson hopefully will help us consider whether we have been seeking God's will and doing God's will with our lives. So, looking at our... Oh, where'd my slides go, Caleb? There we go. Okay. So today, the first one we're going to look at is sensitivity to God's will. So like any father, I don't know about you guys, but when our kids were little, and I'm ashamed to admit it's kind of fallen off, but when you guys had kids, did you pray for the spouse of your future child? You know, pray for us, it's boys, so you pray for the little girl that's destined to be their wives. Pray that she would grow up and become a godly young lady. If you have a girl, it's a different story. But we care about our children and who they're going to marry someday, right? And we're going to see that Abraham wanted his son to marry a good woman and enjoy a wonderful marriage. So at this point, Abraham was advanced in years, but he wasn't senile. He was 140 years old. He showed some signs of aging, but he lived another 35 years, eventually remarrying and fathering 6 more kids. So he lived a long life. And we see in chapter 24, verse 1, that the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Abraham had put God first. You know, he messed up a little bit, but he always put God first. And Abraham had not sought health at first, but he was healthy. Because he sought God first, we see that Abraham was healthy, although he didn't look for health. He didn't seek possessions, but that God had given him abundant possessions. And he had not sought greatness, but God made him great. As a father, the 3 major monotheistic religions claim him as their father. So he was made great. And his closing years were full of contentment, spiritual joy, and blessing. So we learned that the Abrahamic covenant, which guaranteed the ultimate possession of Canaan by Abraham's descendants, was to be established through Isaac, the son of the promised seed. Because of his faith of that covenant, here in Genesis 24, Abraham proceeded to make arrangements for his suitable wife, for Isaac. So he summoned the servant who managed his household in chapter 2. The Bible doesn't identify this servant, but we think it may have been Eleazar, the one who would be the heir had Isaac not come along. We think it was Eleazar. In verse 3, we see that Eleazar put his hand under Abraham's thigh, and he swears an oath at Abraham's request. Now, this is a common practice in those days, because we're going to see this practice occurring again in Genesis 47:29, when Jacob asked Joseph to put his hand under his thigh and make an oath that when he dies, his children would not leave him buried in Egypt, but would carry his body back to the promised land so he could lie with his fathers. So it was a common custom. And according to some of the commentaries I looked at, this oath is a solemn sign that if the oath were not carried out, the children who would be born to Abraham would avenge the servant's unfaithfulness. Now, I don't get that from the passage, but many of the commentaries do, so maybe there's other passages in the Bible, characteristics of that type of oath, which tell us that. So it was a pretty serious oath. Can someone read Genesis 24, 1 through 4?
Now Abraham was old, well advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. So Abraham said to the oldest servant of his house, who ruled over all that he had, please put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. But you shall go to my country and to my family, and take a wife for my son Isaac.
So how seriously do you think Abraham took God's will for a wife for Isaac?
Very serious.
Right. Very serious. He made his servant swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that he would not take a daughter from the daughters of the Canaanites, a wife from the daughters of the Canaanites. So, if you consider Abraham, he's in a foreign land. He hasn't received his land yet. Could Abraham have been influenced by the worldly considerations? You know, it might have been acceptable for Isaac to marry a prominent Canaanite who would have given him acceptance and influence in the land. Do you think that was possible?
Well, we find in other scriptures that refer to the fact that if they marry outside of there, they would end up being pulled away from
No doubt.
beliefs.
So there were definitely problems had he done that.
Right.
But he could have, right? He could have, but that's how seriously he took God and God's covenant with him. Is that he didn't want that. It would have possibly given him influence in the land. It would have made him even more important. I mean, suppose his daughter married a king of one of the Canaanites, right? But he chose not to do that. And that's another area where we see faith in Abraham's life. It turns out Abraham did not compromise his family with an unholy alliance. And he would not arrange a union with a pagan bride. No, Isaac's bride would have to be a believer in Jehovah. And Eleazar, when he leaves to go do this, he travels 500 miles, over 500 miles back to Abraham's native land in Mesopotamia. So in verse 5, we see that the servant wondered if he should take Isaac with him to Mesopotamia in the event that no suitable bride would make the journey from Mesopotamia back to Canaan. Can someone read verses 5 and 6?
And the servant said to him, perhaps the woman will not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I take your son back to the land from which you came? But Abraham said to him, beware that you do not take my son back there.
Why do you think Abraham didn't want his son to go back? Temptation, okay. The temptation to what? Find out. Okay. The commentary says, well, maybe Abraham didn't want him to go back and fall in love with the area and decide, you know what, this is better here than back home. I'm going to stay here. That's what the book says. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. Do you remember last week when we talked about Isaac being a type of Christ, and we see all those instances in Isaac's life where it would foretell what Christ did for us? One of the things I think is interesting is if you look at the ministry of Christ, he never once left the land of Israel. I wonder if this is God's telling Abraham he is not to leave the land because he's going to continue the typology of Christ. Isaac will not leave the land. I don't know if that's true or not. I like that idea more than what the book says, that he might get tempted and just decide to stay. So it's just a thought. But in any case, Canaan was the land that the Lord swore to Abraham's seed. Abraham said that the angel would prepare the way for the servant and his mission would be successful. So if you have your Bibles up and just look at verses 7 and 9, we're going to see that the servant would be free of his obligation to Abraham if the woman would not follow him. But he did not need to envision failure because it was God's will. And then Abraham wanted the servant to share his confidence in the Lord. And when we doubt, we influence others to doubt, don't we? And when we trust God, we influence others to trust God. Abraham is trying to influence his servant to trust God. So verse 9 concludes the matter that Eliezer does in fact follow through with the oath, places his hand under Abraham's thigh, and swears to Abraham concerning finding a wife for Isaac. So moving on to our next part of the outline, the servant's God-directed decision. Now, verses 10 through 67, just to read that would take half a class. So this is one of the areas we just kind of skip over. We just get a summary of what's going on. So in the verse, starting in verse 10, the servant with a caravan of 10 camels and all sorts of his master's valuables journeyed more than 500 miles across the desert to Haran. So the long, grueling trip would have made it very tempting for the servant to just pick a wife from Canaan, but he chose to honor his master's request. Can someone read verses 12 to 14?
And he said, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are come out to draw water. Let the young woman whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and whom shall say, drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one whom you appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master.
So what did the servant do to make sure he would know God's will? He prayed.
God for a specific thing to happen.
He prayed very specifically, right? I mean, don't leave any question. Any of you guys ever pray specifically and see a prayer answered? I'm afraid to say, I'm embarrassed to say I don't always pray specifically enough, and maybe this is a lesson for me as well, is to pray specifically. I guess when I had just gone into 9th grade, and there was a girl I liked, and I was just too afraid to talk to her. And so I remember praying at night, oh God, maybe tomorrow, if I go in class and she's combing her hair, that'll be a sign. I walked into class the next day and she was combing her hair, but I freaked out so bad I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't talk to her. So hopefully in our own lives, we can learn to pray specifically. And we can learn to trust God and act on God's answer. So he was very specific with God. The servant stopped at a well just outside of Nahor. And we see in verses 15 through 21 that Rebekah was just leaving the well with a pitcher of water on her shoulders when Abraham's servants came running to meet her. Yes. So they were strangers to each other, but it was God's guidance that brought them together. Hadn't he prayed? The servant's sign that he requested of God would be something of a test of the young woman's character qualities. He would ask her for a drink of water. How would she respond? How would she treat a travel-weary stranger? Would she be the kind of person to volunteer water for 10 camels? I mean, think about how much water can 10 camels drink? A lot. They store it in their bodies. Would she be that energetic and gracious? Turns out she was. She responded with hospitableness. She quickly lowered her pitcher to give the servant a drink and then offered to draw water for his camels too. In verse 21, while Rebekah was watering the camels, the servant silently observed her, wondering if God was fulfilling his prayer right now. And if he was right now fulfilling his search to find a bride for Isaac. I can only imagine what was going through his head. Can someone read 19 through 25?
And when she had done giving him drink, she said, I will draw water for thy camels also until they have done drinking. And she hasted and emptied her pitcher into the trough and ran again to the well to draw water and drew for all his camels. And the man, wondering at her, held his peace to know whether the Lord had made his journey prosperous or not. And it came to pass, as the camels had done drinking, that the man took a golden earring of half shekel weight and 2 bracelets for her hands and 10 shekels weight of gold. And he said, Whose daughter art thou? Tell me, I pray thee, is there room in thy father's house for us to lodge? And she said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, which she bare unto Nahor. She said moreover unto him, We have both straw and provender enough, and room to lodge in.
So he finds this woman, Rebecca. She's willing to give him water and water the camels. Is his mission over? He still hasn't fulfilled his mission, right? He has to find out who this girl is, has to find out about her family, right? About the woman's heritage. So he couldn't base his decision on just how good of a worker she was and how hospitable she was. He wanted to honor God's will. So he asked the woman whose daughter she was. How excited do you think his servant would have been when he found out, hey, she is from the right family? One, he might be excited that the mission looks like it's going to be fulfilled, but that he can go back home. I don't know. But nonetheless, you got to figure he's excited. So the golden nose ring and bracelets that he gave her was expensive jewelry. So the nose ring weighed half a shekel. That's 1/5 an ounce of gold. And the bracelets weighed 10 shekels. That's another 4 ounces. So altogether, we're talking about a total weight of jewelry of 4 and 1/20 of an ounce of gold. Anybody know how much that is by today's standards?
Is that like $20,000 or something?
Well, if you look at the spot closing on Friday, it comes out to $17,309.88. That's a current spot. That's a pretty expensive gift to give, isn't it? For somebody to give you a drink and to water your camels. So he doesn't even know if she's the one yet, or if she'll even come back to Canaan yet, but he gave that gift. So Genesis 26 through 27 says, Then the man bowed down his head and worshiped the Lord. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his mercy and his truth toward my master. As for me, being on the way, the Lord led me to the house of my master's brethren. How would you describe the servant's response to God when he learned God's will? If the servant hadn't learned it before, after being with Abraham all these years, do you think he learned something about God today? I think he did.
I think he learned he could trust God.
Yeah, I think you're right. Nonetheless, he was very appreciative, right? He worshiped and he was joyful. He had prayed for guidance, he had trusted God for guidance, and God granted it. So Rebecca runs ahead and told her mother's household what had happened. Her brother Laban ran out to the well to meet the servant. So Laban invites Eleazar back to the house and to lodge them. Eleazar, the servant, meets Rebecca's family. I keep saying Eleazar because that's who they think it is. Maybe I should just say servant. The servant goes back and meets Rebecca's family, her brother Laban and her father Bethuel. Rebecca's father Bethuel comes in and out of the story. He doesn't seem to be a major player, but Laban seems to be more involved in what's going on here. And the interesting thing about Laban is that we see his response to Abraham's servants. And he hears Rebekah's story and he sees the jewelry. And what's his response? He runs out, right? He sees the gold. This gives us some insight into the heart of Laban. Who knows does anybody know where Laban comes in later in Genesis?
He's the father of Leah and Rachel.
He tricks Jacob. And I think the way that he comes running out, we get insight into the real heart of Laban and who he really is. So it looks like he's more motivated by ulterior motives rather than saying that his sister is well taken care of. But Eleazar then recounts the full story. Abraham's instructions, the oath, his prayer as well, about his prayer at the well, and how Rebekah perfectly matched the sign, showing God's guidance. Eleazar emphasizes Abraham's wealth and that Isaac is his heir. And of course, Laban's ears are perked up at this point. So the family recognizes this is from the Lord and agrees to let Rebekah go as Isaac's wife. So gifts are exchanged, a dowry type thing, and then after a night stay, the servants want to leave immediately. And then we see that the family tries to delay it a little bit, but Rebekah herself says, "No, I'm going now." That says something about Rebekah, doesn't it? Her own family tried to delay it, and she said, "Nope, I'm going now." So Rebekah has been permitted by her family to leave and to marry Isaac. So the rest of our passage in Genesis 24 covers the long trip back to Canaan. Rebekah and her maids travel back with the servants on camels. Meanwhile, Isaac is living in the Negev desert and meditating in the field one evening when he sees the camels approaching. Isaac was meditating, it says. The word here, the Hebrew word is suah. And it means to walk about, pray, wail, lament, or moan. Why would he be wailing and lamenting? Yeah. Now, if you look at the passage, it looks like his mom might have died later because he takes Rebekah back to his mother's tent. But many scholars believe that she has already passed at this point. And that is why he is wailing. And they suggest that he was in the field, and his mother passed while Eleazar was away finding a wife. But Rebekah, she sees Isaac, she veils herself and learns who he is. And the servant tells Isaac everything that happens. Isaac then brings Rebekah into his mother's tent, marries her, and he loves her. So that's where people might get confused or say, well, maybe she was alive. But I think it's, from what I was reading in the commentaries, Sarah could have had a separate tent that was called hers. And so with it being vacant, he could have taken her back to that tent. But they were married, and their love developed and grew strong. Which takes us to the end of chapter 24. But we do see that Rebekah is a comfort to Isaac after his mother's death. And that brings us to the close of chapter 24. So moving on, we're talking about insensitivity to God's will. The book doesn't cover Genesis 25, 1 through 9, but instead opens at verse 20. I think it's appropriate to do just a quick summary that the book doesn't cover. Because I think it's important because it transitions us into the next part of the story starting in verse 20. In verses 1 through 6, we learned about Abraham's later life and family. After Sarah's death, Abraham marries Keturah. She bore him 6 sons. These sons became ancestors of various tribes and peoples, the Midianites and some of them. Abraham also gives gifts to his sons. to the sons of his concubines. However, he deliberately gives all of his inheritance and primary blessing to Isaac, the son of the promise. We see that he also sends those sons away that he had through Keturah. And the commentaries say is probably to avoid conflict, because Abraham knows that Isaac is the promised seed. He's sending them away to avoid conflict. Talks about Abraham's death and burial in verses 7 through 11. He lives to be 175 years old. And we see that Isaac and Ishmael bury him in the cave of Machpelah near Hebron, alongside Sarah in the field that Abraham had purchased for Sarah. And after Abraham's death, God blesses Isaac, who settles near Beer-Lahai. And then it gives an account of Ishmael, verses 12 through 18. It gives a genealogy of his 12 sons. And then in verse 19, we see the transition to Isaac's generations. Verses 19 introduces the next section. It says, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. And it briefly notes Abraham fathered Isaac, and it sets up the story for Isaac and Rebekah. So I think it's necessary because those verses set the story for what we're going to see next. So we see here in verse 40, Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. So in verse 21, he pleads with God for his wife Rebekah because she was barren. Just like Sarah was. And God answers Isaac's pleas, and she conceives. God would prove to Isaac what he had proved to Abraham, that the fulfillment of his promises is completely a matter of his grace and power. When Rebekah was pregnant, she felt an unusual movement within her, and she asked what that meant. And the Lord told her that she was carrying twins that would become two nations that would be separate from one another. He also told her that the elder would serve the younger. So who was the younger? Jacob. And it said Esau would be the servant of Jacob. It's in the promise, right? But we're going to see them try to guile or beguile their way into that promise, even though God had already made it. So the struggle begins with with Jacob and Esau. Esau means hairy. And they named the second son Jacob, which means heel catcher, because when they were born, Jacob was holding Esau's heel. So Esau became a skillful hunter, living in open fields, while Jacob developed into a quiet man living in tents. Now, this is necessary because we're going to see how the trickery happened. It's necessary to know who they were. Isaac was hairy, Jacob was not. And the way Isaac and Rebekah related to their sons differently launched the family into a dysfunctional existence. Isaac was partial to Esau, and Rebekah favored Jacob. So that's where the problems in these families starts. So let's move to the next part. Jacob connives to ensure God's will. One day Esau came in from a hunting trip just as Jacob was boiling some red pottage. He asked for some pottage because he was faint with hunger. Esau says, "Man, I'm hungry. Please give me some food. I'm going to die." Jacob, being crafty, answers Esau and says, "Sell me your birthright, and I'll give you some porridge or some pottage." So Jacob appreciated spiritual values, but he attempted to gain the right thing, the wrong way. Jacob understood the spiritual value of a birthright. Esau did not. He didn't care. So Jacob tries to go about it the wrong way. But he should have waited for God to grant him the birthright in his own time and in his own way. Genesis 25:31 tells us, "But Jacob said, 'Sell me your birthright.' as of this day. So what does Jacob reveal about his understanding of God here?
Jacob definitely believes in self-help.
What's that?
He believes in self-help.
Yeah, you know, how many people have tried to tell you that the Bible says God helps those who help themselves? Right? It doesn't, but I'm thinking Jacob thought that. And we'll know later that Jacob has some problems, and he comes to a come to Jesus moment, and it changes his faith. He knows about God. He understands it's important. Jacob was conniving to get what God had promised to him, as if gaining the birthright was a game he was playing. Esau said that his birthright was useless or worthless, since he would die if he didn't get anything to eat right away. Do you think he really would have died? No. He's being kind of dramatic, isn't he? But that's how little he valued his birthright.
Sounds like a teenager.
Right? If he was such a mighty hunter and he'd been out hunting for weeks, don't you think he would have caught something and had something to eat, right? So he overstated his problem and then despised his birthright. So Esau, in verse 32, didn't think it was worth very much. And for this reason, in Hebrews 12:6, it calls Esau a profane person. Profanity is a sin of treating lightly and casually what ought to be treated seriously and highly. So we know that Esau's whole life was profane. He lived as though spiritual matters were of little value. Isn't that how we lived before Christ? We all lived profane lives. So Jacob must have thought at this point he had the birthright settled, right? But it doesn't stop here. God's will for him to have the birthright, it was God's will, and he thought he had just secured it. But the thing about Jacob here is this. Though Jacob was not righteous, and he wasn't, because we're going to learn some things about him. He wasn't a righteous guy at this time. So he was not righteous. He was not in this instant deceptive. That was God's plan, right? He was not, the book says it wasn't that he was deceptive. He was open and obvious. He knew what he was doing. There was no deception there. But he was unscrupulous, right? So he must be given credit for knowing what value he was going after, the birthright. Esau, however, was totally godless, and he obviously didn't get it. So the lesson for us here as believers is we should seek things of spiritual value, and that we should avoid the devices of the flesh, right? Avoid the things of the world. Seek godly things. So before we move on to our next point, I just want to say that there's so much more going on in that story. If you want to research that, I think you'll find some really neat things going on. So the next point, Isaac ignores God's will. Bless you. In verse 26, 1-6, we see that there's another famine that hits the land. The Lord appears to Isaac and told him to stay in the land and to refrain from going to Egypt. That's what God tells him to do. Egypt was a logical place to go, but God didn't want Isaac there. He said he will provide for him in the land. And apparently the land of the Philistines, specifically Gerar, qualified as in the land. So the land of the Philistines is part of the promise. God also restated the Abrahamic covenant to remind Isaac that his plan included Isaac's survival. And that's also in verses 1-6. So while in Gerar, Isaac told Abimelech. Do you guys remember Abimelech? Didn't Abraham have dealings with Abimelech? He did. So it's probably not the same person. So it's a kingly title, probably, is what the commentaries say. So he's dealing with the king of the same land. So Isaac tells Abimelech, another king of the Philistines, that he and Rebekah were siblings. Like father, like son, right? Apple didn't fall far from that tree. So Rebekah was beautiful. Isaac thought that someone in Gerar might kill him to get Rebekah if they knew they were married. The truth is, at least when Abraham did it, he was deceptive, but he wasn't lying, right? Because Sarah was his half-sister. Isaac is just flat out, outright lying. And the king confronts Isaac and expresses his anger at the danger he had put his people in. Same story with Abraham, right? Will someone read Genesis 26:7?
And the man of the place asked about his wife, and he said, "She is my sister," for he was afraid to say, "She is my wife," because he thought, "Lest the man of this place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold."
What motivated him to use deception with Abimelech?
Self-preservation.
Self-preservation. What else? It's not obvious. If you remember that God reiterated the promise, it becomes more obvious. His lack of faith. That was his motivation, right? Self-interest. I mean, he didn't want to be hurt, but really it comes down to lack of faith, once again. His fear was a symptom of his lack of faith in God or trust in God. Despite this, God promised Isaac and Gerar so greatly that the people kicked him out. I mean, he prospered Isaac so greatly that the people kicked him out. So like father, like son, once again, Abraham doesn't trust God, and God, in spite of that, blesses him. And we see the same thing happens to Jacob. Despite his lack of faith, God blesses him so greatly that the people kick him out. So he gets kicked out of Gerar, but he keeps having problems in the fields with water wells. So he went to Bathsheba, where God appeared to him again and told him to fear not. God again reassured Isaac that he would multiply his descendants. Isaac responded by building an altar and calling on the name of the Lord. And that's in verses 17 through 25. And Abimelech came back on the scene to renew a covenant with Isaac. And he's renewing the original covenant that Abraham had with King Abimelech. I think that's interesting. Genesis 26:24 tells us, and then the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake." So God tells Isaac not to fear because he would be with him. Turns out the assurance of God's presence with Isaac didn't have a lasting effect. We will see later that he ignored both God's presence with him and God's will. So to conclude chapter 26, of course we're just flying through this, we see that Esau marries two brides from the Hittites. Starting in chapter 27, when Isaac is old and blind, he thought he would die soon. Turns out he was mistaken. He'll live a lot longer. Maybe he had a cold. You know how guys are when they get said, "I'm dying." I don't know. But he thought he was going to die. Turns out he's going to live a lot longer. But anyhow, so he must have been sick somehow. But Isaac, you got to remember, preferred Esau over Jacob, right? So what do you think Isaac wanted to do? Who did he want to give the birthright to?
To Esau.
Esau. Is that in violation of what God told him? So Isaac is now old and he still hasn't learned everything, has he? That's probably comforting for us because I haven't learned to trust God completely either. But nonetheless, He's old, and Isaac wanted to confirm the birthright blessing to Isaac in spite of God's plan. And that was back in 25:23 when he says, the elder shall serve the younger. He blatantly ignored God's will in favor of his own. And the fact that Esau married 2 Hittite wives should have caused Isaac to reconsider his plan. What do you think? He was so convinced that he was going to give it to Isaac. He didn't care. To Esau, that he didn't care that Esau married Hittite wives. But Isaac goes forward with it anyways, and he asks Esau to go hunt game and prepare him a festive meal, after which he would bless us, which he would bless him. And then that takes us to the next point of our outline, and that's Rebekah demands her will. So Rebekah overhears this conversation that he's having with Esau, and she devises her own plan. She commanded Jacob to obey her in verse 8. She says, so Rebekah spoke to Jacob, her son, saying, indeed, I heard your father speak to Esau, your brother, saying, bring me game and make savory food for me, that I may eat it and bless you in the presence of the Lord before my death. Now, therefore, my son, obey my voice according to what I commanded you. So though Rebekah was Jacob's mother and had some measure of authority over him, she was playing the role of ultimate authority in his life. By conniving, right, and deceiving, she was usurping God. That was a role that belonged to God. Rebekah loved Jacob, but she was willing to involve him in deceit, distort his thinking, and degrade his character. So she was willing to do all of that. Don't blame it all on her, because Jacob was willing to run right in there with her, right? So Rebekah continues the family dysfunction, and the disruption of her family to get her way betrayed the fact that she loved herself more than Isaac, Jacob, or even the Lord. She wanted her way. So quickly deciding what to do, Rebekah told Jacob to pretend to be Esau to trick his father into blessing or bestowing a blessing on him. So according to the book, it tells us that Jacob's response was disappointing because Jacob said nothing to his mother about the plot being deceitful or sinful. I think that the fact that he didn't tell her goes along with the character he's had all along. To disappoint Jacob's actions here would have been out of character. I don't know why I wrote that. So in other words, if Jacob didn't follow her and try to deceive, that actually would have been out of character for him, right? He's been a deceiver, unscrupulous his whole life. So the fact that he went with it really isn't a disappointment to any of us. We knew that he would do that. Jacob did act a little bit cautious, afraid of being discovered in his attempted deception. And in verse 12 and 13, we see that he was worried about a curse being upon him, that it shall bring a curse upon him and not a blessing. And he was concerned about the consequences, not the principles. And Rebekah responded, upon me be thy curse, my son. So Jacob was going to do it. He wasn't concerned about anything but being caught. Next point. We're really having to go through this. Next point, Jacob claims God's will. Rebekah disguised Jacob well. He went to his father and said he was Esau, his father's firstborn. Isaac was suspicious. Am I messing the names up? I apologize. Okay, Isaac was suspicious. He wanted to know how Isaac could have found the game so quickly. Jacob added a bold-faced lie to his duplicity. 19 through 20 tells us Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done just as you told me. Please arise, sit and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me. But Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? And he said, because the Lord your God has brought it to me. So Jacob lied to his father. He even profaned God's name by telling him that God brought it to him. No doubt he was hoping that claiming God was involved in the process would cause Isaac to stop this line of questioning. But Isaac still wasn't convinced. The fact that he still wasn't convinced, what's that tell you about Isaac's trust in his son Jacob? He knew he didn't trust Jacob. Otherwise, he wouldn't keep questioning, but he questions again. So Isaac requested that he come near so he could feel to make sure he was dealing with Esau. It says, because Jacob was disguised, Isaac observed the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. That's in 21 and 22. Still not convinced, he asks again 3 times now, are you really my son Esau? That's in verse 24. And Jacob boldly lied again, and he says, I am. So Isaac blesses Jacob, thinking he was Esau. He promised him prosperity, dominion, and protection, verses 28 and 29. And lastly, our last point is Esau seeks to destroy God's will. Jacob had just left his father when Esau came in from his hunting trip. He too prepared a tasty meal for his father and invited his father to eat. In startled response, Isaac cried, who are you? And verse 32. The realization of what happened shook Isaac to the core of his being. And we know that because it tells us that he trembled. It caused him to tremble very exceedingly in verse 33. So the thing about these blessings is they are unrevocable or irrevocable. So Isaac blessed Jacob, and that blessing is irrevocable. The blessing could not be reversed. Esau also knew that he had forfeited the blessing and was wrong in trying to obtain it, right? Because remember, Esau knew he sold it, but he still tried to obtain it. So both boys are kind of playing the game a little bit, right? So Esau wept, but he found no place of repentance. He had no way to change his father's mind. And of course, the rest of the story is that we know that Esau plans to kill Jacob. And that plan was a decision to destroy God's will, since Jacob was God's chosen one. Do you think that Esau knew that Jacob was God's chosen one? I think he did. Because didn't God tell Isaac that the younger or the older would serve the younger? Since Rebekah favored Jacob, don't you think she probably told him more than once or twice in his life that that birthright is yours? And don't you think that Esau once or twice in his life had heard that story? So he knew what was happening. He knew it wasn't his birthright, and yet he still tried to get it. So Esau's decision is not unlike Cain's decision. They were both guilty of murder, but only Cain had the chance to actually carry out his plan. Upon learning that Esau hated Jacob for what he had done, Rebekah reacted by sending Jacob away. It turns out he stayed away for 24 years. You see that in verse 44. Rebekah also taught Jacob to scheme. Instead of encouraging him to trust God, she taught him to get what he could by unholy means. So Isaac was not without blame here, and neither was Esau. Isaac had tried to thwart God's plan because he favored Esau over Jacob. In all cases, God was relegated as a bystander. And of course, that's what the whole subject of our lesson is today. All 4 family members did their own thing without actually consulting God and asking him to intervene. How often do we do that in our lives? We have our plans and we want to do it, and God kind of becomes an afterthought in our lives. So the whole purpose of this lesson is to encourage you to think differently about God and subject your will to his. And let's just see how God can bless your life too. That's all I have. Anybody have any questions?
I just want to say, I never really thought about that part where Isaac is trying to bless Esau as his motivation being against God's plan to have Esau serve Jacob. I never thought of it in that context. That this was God's plan, and Isaac should have gone along with that, and we don't ever see him doing that. So I just want to say that's a new, enlightening kind of perspective for me.
I agree with you. To be honest, never entered my mind. How many times have I read that and it never entered my mind that Isaac was going against God's will? Anybody else have any statements, questions?
Kind of along that line, I have a little insert in my Bible talking about God will take our disobedience and it doesn't mess up his plans. But also, God is not bound by culture and what would be considered normal and right, which is why, he identified Jacob to be over Esau.
Right. I like the image of God as a chess player, and he's playing chess with somebody. God doesn't have to tell somebody, okay, you got to make this move, and then you got to make this move so that I can win. God will let them make any move they want, and God still wins. That's how powerful our God is he doesn't have to design the game to favor him in order to win. Okay. That's all I have. I'll close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the day you've given us. We thank you for loving us and caring for us, for providing for us, and giving us a wonderful church family that we can come together in fellowship and have a good time with. Just pray that you'd be glorified through our lesson today, that you have been, and that as we leave here today, we'd remember your will in our lives, and that we learn to subject ourselves to it. Because we know you want good things for us, and we know you have a plan to develop our character and make us godly. You want to sanctify us. And I just pray that we'd all give you open rein to sanctify us in a way that you seem fit. As we leave here today, I just pray that you give us courage to reach the world around us, and that you keep us safe until we come back again. In your son's name I pray, amen.